I'm so happy Evan's busy schedule worked out for us today. But before I turn the program over to Dave, and as I mentioned in full transparency, Dave has been a friend, a colleague, and a mentor for 32 years and really helped me personally and our company. And I just thought it'd be interesting to share what I know about him. By way of career path, Dave has been both a traditional entrepreneur and a corporate entrepreneur. Work at PNC Venture Capital, work in corporate healthcare, and to my knowledge, he helped found IndustryNet, which was probably the first e-commerce company in the world. So Dave's been around the block. By the way of education, and I always love to tease him about this, he's very balanced in both technology and business, as much as anybody I know to be able to have that. But he has this BS in physics. And in my career, I've always found physicists to see the world so clearly. And I think Dave's been able to do that. And I think it shows in the work he's been able to do at Tepper, along with a lot of people, to pull together all these entrepreneurial programs across the campus. Not an easy thing to do business-wise or politically. Dave also has an MBA from Carnegie Mellon University, and has just been a great friend. So Dave, I want to thank you for that. Now let me turn it over to you and get on with the keynote.
Thank you, Louis. That was very, very kind of you. I really appreciate it. And I'm a pinch hitter today, pinch hitting for Sean, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us. But I'm suspecting that yours, Sean's, and my mutual friend, Bob Evans, was instrumental in helping us to get connected with Evan Goldberg. So, Evan, we're so pleased to have you join us today. I must tell you, in one of the many businesses I'm involved in, we were a year 2000 NetSuite customer, and still continue to be a NetSuite customer. Love the product. It really helped us through lots of ups and downs of the entrepreneurial journey. And so, for those of you that haven't had a chance to read the agenda, Evan is the founder of NetSuite, now owned by Oracle. And Evan, could you please just give us a real short background of how you came to found NetSuite and sort of what your background in growing this company has been? Because it looks like it's had lots of great ups and downs and twists and turns that all entrepreneurial companies have had.
Well, thanks, Dave, and thanks for having me today. So NetSuite is a 23-year young company. And so I have to think back a ways when you ask that question. But seriously, I always wanted to have a software company or build a software company that sort of helped people, in their daily lives. It's something I've always found appealing. And I went to college. I actually majored in math. So I don't know if mathematicians, I would say, maybe see the world even more clearly than physicists, but I don't, maybe not. They may not see the world at all, in fact. So in that way, maybe less clearly. But getting out of college, I went and worked at Oracle. And always my interest there was, how do you take this powerful technology, in this case, database technology, and make it more accessible, easier to use, more available to sort of the general population. That's all been something that's run through my entire career. I left Oracle and did another startup. It didn't work out. That was sort of my mandatory Silicon Valley failure. And, despite the disappointments there, I learned a lot about business. I learned a lot about, just being a CEO, but also what's required to really understand your business and move your business forward. And that was sort of the impetus to start NetSuite. I was fortunate enough that, I developed a relationship early in my career with Larry Ellison at Oracle. He was sort of thinking along the same lines at about the same time. He helped me with my first startup, but sort of in the background. This was one where it was more of a mind meld. And really, in the course of a 5-minute phone conversation, we realized that we were both thinking sort of very similarly, I guess you'd say, in a very complementary way. I was thinking about how to make business software more easy to use and easier to access and available to smaller companies. and getting rid of the hassles of having all these different systems that don't work together and don't give you good information. And he was thinking about the cloud and how, businesses are going to, run software in a very, very different way than they ever had before. He was really convinced of that back in 1998. And so in the course of basically a 5-minute phone conversation, we came up with the vision for NetSuite, which is a, system to help you run your entire business, delivered over the web so that you don't have to worry about managing and maintaining it. And it's available anytime, anywhere. And that was somewhat novel back then. I mean, Salesforce.com started. My friend Mark Benioff, who was also having these similar conversations to us at the same time, started about 6 months later. So at the time, it was novel, and the benefit of that sort of early mover, especially when you're building something as complicated as a business system, what's called in the industry ERP system, or that's much of it, you need a lot of time. And so we were lucky to, timing is a lot of in success. And then we had good timing.
So Evan, that's an interesting time. 1998, broadband wasn't widely available even in businesses. We had a thing called DSL lines, if you remember them back in the day. So obviously, responsiveness must have been an issue. But what really do you think made NetSuite unique in those early days?
Well, I mean, really, we were building initially just sort of accounting for small companies. That was where we started. That was sort of Larry's idea. I mean, I wanted to start with sales. Fortunately, Mark went off and did that. But he said, you got to start with accounting because that's sort of the core of a business's operations. It has all of your products and your people and your, everything, all your financials and everything that, is the core, obviously, of what you're thinking about as business. Am I making money? So that's where we started. And, it was, so that part of it was really just building something that sort of had already been there. And what was unique about this was that you could get the information anytime, anywhere. That really was the unique initial value proposition for any company that was somewhat mobile, had people in multiple locations, maybe was, there really were, it turns out there were a lot of companies that didn't just have a fixed single location where they could store a server that had their information. Though even if you had that, like that still wasn't adequate because there wasn't one system to tie it all together. But still, that was probably the initial appeal. It took a while for people to get used to it. You mentioned broadband. We thought a lot about how does our system work on a modem. It's kind of humorous to think back on that. But the first time that I saw, and in fact, I went to a party at Larry's house where my one interaction with Steve Jobs was where he said, well, Larry's really excited about this accounting in a browser that you're doing, but does anyone want to do that? Does anyone want to, do accounting in a browser? And I was kind of like, I don't know. Larry seems convinced, so I'm going with it. But when it was probably just a couple of weeks later that we uploaded our QuickBooks file that we were using for our business into our new nation system that did similar to what QuickBooks did. And I saw at my home, on the web, sort of everything I needed to know about my business. And that was the aha moment where I was like, for Larry's part of the idea, that was the aha moment where I was like, oh yeah, this is going to work.
Interesting. The buzzword in startups today is customer discovery, right? Understand what the customer wants and then build it for them. And you guys have developed a reputation for doing, field trips to your customers. And I'm sure that started way back then when Steve Jobs asked the fateful question, if you build it, will they come, right? So can you tell us how that customer field trip program has developed and evolved over time?
Yeah, well, I actually learned about this from someone that came into the company from another company that had done it. This is, many years ago. And I was really intrigued by it. I mean, we certainly always talk to customers, and that's where you get a lot of your great ideas. And that's obviously where you test a lot of your innovation. You can have, things can seem great in theory, but until you put them in customers' hands, you don't really know whether it's as good an idea as you thought it was. But going to them in their location and seeing everything, sort of the entire context in which your product is being used, it has an additional level of value. And so I think, and also bringing people in the organization that don't necessarily directly do customer interaction, but getting them to be able to connect the dots between what they're doing and what the end result for the customer in their world is, I think is incredibly motivating. And it's also, a big driver of innovation. So the engineers, they don't necessarily get a lot of interaction with customers in a software company, and that's been invaluable.
Yeah. Well, the academics would call what you described as ethnographic research. I think the tools that have developed over time, we're going to hear from Alex Osterwalder tomorrow, are design thinking techniques, right? How do we get in and passively and interactively observe without creating bias? So that's really great that you've done that. Now you're 23 years old and growing, and ultimately when companies get bigger and older, they sometimes tend to not innovate the way that they used to. How do you keep the entrepreneurial spirit alive at NetSuite?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's relevant for every size company because, small companies want to become big someday. So thinking about this and early on and making sure you're capturing that spirit of innovation and you can sort of bottle it and use it for a long time. I mean, it's definitely a cultural thing. And what we try, well, there's many different ways that we try to do this, because you're absolutely right. And, another problem, it's not just being big, it's being successful. It's very easy to rest on your laurels. It's work. It ain't broke, don't fix it. Works for a while until suddenly it doesn't, because some other upstart competitor has leaped ahead of you. You want to do the leaping. You want to obviously disrupt yourself, to use a more, relatively modern term. And how do you keep that sort of mentality of questioning everything and seeing, the future as, not as a narrow path, but as so many, opportunities.
Right.
So part of it is culture. And what we try to do is recapture the culture or sort of relive the history of the company, so everybody understands where our mindset was and can kind of, then relate and hopefully develop that mindset in themselves. We have something called the El Camino Club, which is named after the street on which the company was established, in a small office in basically above a hair salon next to a liquor store. The El Camino Club we use to find people that have really thought outside the box, that have had that entrepreneurial spirit and have treated, their job as like a startup and thought that way. So, and then, just kind of offering that as a example of the type of thinking that we always want to have.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
So it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah. So we have a lot of leaders that are listening today that are, excited about trying to recreate the entrepreneurial spirit in their organizations. If you had to kind of limit your advice to one or two things for them, what would you recommend that they try tomorrow to recreate this entrepreneurial spirit?
Well, I think you got to get people outside their comfort zone, obviously. And so there's a lot of different ways to do that. And a lot of it probably happens away from the office, away from the, when you're in a startup, you're thinking about it in the shower. You're thinking about it when you're on your bike ride. You're thinking about it all the time. And so I think giving people an opportunity and challenging them with how would we reinvent this? And I want you to really just expand your mind. And I don't, there's a lot of different ways you can do, you can get people to do that. You can bring them off site, but you can bring them to customers, as I said, but just really encouraging people to break some glass. And you got to put guideposts around it to know that, we're not necessarily going to do everything, just like a hackathon. When you do a hackathon in a software company, you're not going to use everything that everybody comes up with, but you're going to get some wild ideas, because that's sort of the mentality of it is, think like, that startup person in the garage about and solve these problems in a very short amount of time. And that kind of focused, like thinking, you're forced to sort of think outside the box first, that recreates what it was like in the early days. So that the hackathons and those kinds, just things that are different and get people outside their normal way of thinking it differs, I'm sure, from company to company.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. If you don't mind, can we transition to talking a little bit about product and product strategy at NetSuite? So how do you think about the blend of focusing on the current key objectives, but also keeping your eye on the ball of what's happening on their horizon?
Yeah. Well, if you ask your customers what they want, they're going to just ask you to extend this feature or that feature. Here's a pain point that I have that you can fix in this capability. Sometimes you'll get some really great innovative ideas of a whole new way you could do something, which is great. So that's step one. You have to have that data, and you have to balance that, because if that's all you do, you're not going to make that leap that you talked about, and Gretzky-ish skate where the puck is going. So and it becomes harder and harder as you get more of a legacy of your system, of whatever it is, your product out there that you have to maintain and support. And that's put you in, and you've attracted a certain set of customers because of what you had before. Your next great idea, you may need to be talking to totally different people. So one thing is definitely you need to talk to your customers, and then you have to talk to your non-customers, who will give you a totally different view of the world. And you can say, well, that's not our target, but maybe you'll find that there's something that you have, some asset that you have that you've not leveraged enough, because there's a new target audience that can benefit from it. And for us, that's a lot about industries, for example. Okay. So we think about it in that way. I mean, what you want when you're using a sort of a B2B software product is you want it to be appropriate for your industry. You want to feel like it was designed for the type of company that you are. And so a lot of our sort of product research is around industries, and finding the commonalities is probably the most intriguing thing. And that's, I think, true of any kind of company with a product or service, is if you get that sort of intersectionality where you do research in particular customer segments and you see the overlap that you would not expect. We see manufacturing companies that want very, very similar features to project-based businesses. Mm-hmm. And we have a sort of unique opportunity to do that because we serve both markets. And now we can build something that's sort of unified and obviously from an efficiency perspective, that's important. So that, the research, along different dimensions is really, really important. And then, of course, the innovation that we talked about, and blending those two and figuring out how to balance them becomes increasingly hard as you become a more established company. It's something that we're thinking about a lot right now as we sort of try to reinvent parts of our system and serve our existing customer base. And that's a hard transition to make. You obviously see companies that do it, and you obviously see some companies that fail, and those are the dinosaurs.
No, absolutely. There's obviously a lot of talk about generating value from data. And if you actually go back to your founding in 1998, in the middle of Web 1.0, we used to talk about data exhaust and the value that would be there. And of course, that was all pie in the sky. But here we are 23 years later. How do you actually think about data in the real world today, and how does that weave into your product strategy?
Well, the first thing is, if you have an internet product, you almost have a responsibility, like you're abrogating your responsibility if you're not looking at those signals that you couldn't get, in the past, right? I mean, you'd have to, you have like instant customer research available to you at all times, day and night, and in all kinds of dimensions. What are they clicking on? What do they like? What do they like? What do they not like? What's taking them a long time? What features, when they start using, do they suddenly expand usage of the whole product? Those kinds of things are just right there, not staring at you in the face. You obviously have to use the tools to dig that out of the data. But I mean, for us, that's always been, we've always seen that advantage from day one, and we've leveraged it from day one. but we always know that we can get better at it. The sources of data now are it's really, you could spend all your time thinking about how my, customer is using, you can spend all your resources on it. There'd still be more to learn.
Yeah. Very interesting. It does look like we're going to have time to entertain some questions from the audience since we're going to go up to about 1:45 Eastern time here. So for those of you that are interested in asking Evan questions, please use the Q&A box to do that. I'd like to actually transition to talking a little bit about your relationship with Oracle. And you mentioned that you obviously worked with Larry at the very beginning, and 5-minute conversation, led to this incredible company. But how do you think about Oracle tech as technology and how you're able to leverage that into your products? And then specifically, what are some examples of how you've leveraged this tech and how what's the process you use to choose which technology you leverage?
Yeah. So obviously, we were always heavy Oracle users. There was really no other direction we were going to go on where we were going to store business. I clearly believe that it was the best decision to use Oracle. So we were always sort of tightly tied to Oracle for our core infrastructure. And we're written in Java, which is, sort of shepherded by Oracle now. So that was a good match. When we came back into the company 5 years ago, I think that Oracle was really good about keeping us independent enough that we didn't lose our sort of secret sauce. And we served a different audience than Oracle really had ever targeted. So that was important. And we've been very, I think, thoughtful about where we make the connections. One of the first ones was to start looking at using Oracle's cloud infrastructure to deliver our service. And that's now where all new customers go. And we're in the process of transitioning all our customers to Oracle's cloud infrastructure. It's a great opportunity for us because it gets us out of the business of managing data centers. Sort of it's the same promise, obviously, that all the other cloud providers have: get out of the business of managing computers. And that's the same message we give to our customers, like get out of the business of managing software and upgrades of your business system. So that's been great. And that just being thoughtful about the other areas that we can connect. Oracle has an enormous amount to offer. Interestingly enough, when I first talked to Larry about coming back in, one of my real trepidations is when I was in Oracle back in the 90s, late 80s and 90s, I was the evangelist for making the products easier to use. I was in the Mac group with Mark Benioff. Our whole thing was like, how do you take something as powerful and complex and difficult to use as Oracle and make it accessible to someone using a Mac? And so when I came back in, and I was always swimming upstream, that just wasn't where the company's collective head was at. And that's been true over a long time. And I think Larry would entirely admit that Oracle had a reputation for not having great user interface. In fact, he'd probably say, yeah, and we were proud of it. Mm-hmm. So Oracle's done a 180-degree flip. And Larry is passionate now about reinventing the business user experience. And they've invested an enormous amount of time and resources and brain power into thinking about how to leap ahead in the business user experience. I had no idea this was what I was going to encounter when I came back in, that I'd be swimming downstream. And that's accrued to NetSuite. So engaging with that team of designers and thought leaders on the business user experience and taking that and applying it to our audience of, fast growing, small and medium-sized businesses has been very gratifying and unexpected.
Right. That's a good transition, because I was going to talk to you. You've obviously had an incredibly unique relationship with Oracle throughout the history of NetSuite. Coming back in 5 years ago, leveraging some of the great innovations and technologies that Oracle has is obviously an advantage to you, potentially to competitors. And you just mentioned that. But can you give us some actually more specific examples, maybe one or two, about ways you've been able to improve NetSuite for your customer segment, which is largely different than Oracle's, over the last 5 years?
Right. So there's a couple different ways. There's obviously stuff under the covers. We have a tight relationship with the core database team. That's where I worked when I first started at Oracle, and like the main guy there is still the main guy. So that's very helpful to make sure that, how customers see that is just, more reliability, better security, hopefully something they never see, and better performance, which is something that they definitely see. And so that's, an under the cover relationship that's been enabled by the merging of the companies. On the other end of the spectrum is the fact that we've been able to take some Oracle product offerings and tailor them to NetSuite customers. So one is NetSuite Planning and Budgeting, which is taking the Oracle Planning and Cloud and applying it directly to NetSuite for our most sophisticated companies that do sophisticated planning. So, and similarly, we released recently the NetSuite Analytics Warehouse, which is taking Oracle's Autonomous Data Warehouse and Analytics Cloud technology and applying it directly to NetSuite, so that there's sort of a seamless way to take advantage of these technologies. So it's really on two different dimensions: under the covers, making NetSuite better for customers on a day-to-day basis in things that they don't directly see, and then on another dimension is adding extension capabilities to the product that are really, really tailored for our customer base, but utilize sophisticated technologies out of Oracle, sophisticated products out of Oracle.
Right. Everybody's talking about data science in whatever form, AI, ML, robotic process automation, those sorts of things. Given you have ways to manage that data, how are your customers leveraging that to create new value with these data science technologies for themselves? Any good examples of that?
Yeah, well, we're really trying to think about this from a user-centric point of view. And, again, you talked about design thinking. The first thing is empathy and going in and finding out what are the real problems that they're trying to solve. Technologists in Silicon Valley has a long sordid history of, creating solutions in search of a problem. And, there's great new technology, I dropped out of grad school in AI in 1990. So I figured the timing wasn't quite right. But now it's all coming to fruition, almost or 30 years later. But it is, and it's all anybody talks about. And it's great. And there's obviously been some amazing, consumer technologies that have been enabled by AI. And now the business world, as it often does, is following that and figuring out, where are the problems that we have solutions for. And I think you can see, I'm not going to name the names of certain high profile AI initiatives that were solutions looking for a problem. So we're looking for problems and then saying, where does AI fit? And, a great example of this is, we talk to our customers, and especially in the warehouse distribution industry, where they absolutely require shipments be on time, the right thing at the right time, being able to predict risks to delivering the right product at the right time is hugely valuable. And they have a lot of data to mine on that, from particular vendors. They order from them over and over and over again, and figuring out when those for that particular vendor, what's a risk and what what might gum up the works. We've created something called the supply chain control tower, which is, to use the analogy, you're sitting above the airport and figuring out, which plane might not be able to taxi or whatever. So, and that uses machine learning just to see those patterns and understand what's happened in the past and what might happen similarly in the future that you can't necessarily see just by looking at the data yourselves. So that's a good example of where, we saw a customer's problem and we then said, AI can help here.
Yeah, that's very cool. We talked a lot about the positive examples of being innovative and trying to keep that entrepreneurial spirit going. But we haven't yet talked about sort of some of the pitfalls, and there's always pitfalls, right? There's always mistakes to be made. So what are some of the things that you've learned more recently in the last 5 or 10 years as you've tried to maintain the entrepreneurial spirit in your culture, as you've tried to blaze new paths with innovative products and service extensions? What are some of the mistakes that you've made, and where would you caution our leaders listening today to think twice about certain pathways?
That's a good question, because you always, if you're innovative, of course some things are going to fail. The mantra and out here is fail fast. I think probably our mistakes were not typically not failing fast. They weren't that we tried things that didn't work, but that we stuck with them too long. We got too married to them. Again, that solution in search of a problem, where we're so enamored with what we've come up with that we, are reticent to jettison it, reticent to jettison. When there's ample evidence that it's maybe a great idea in theory, but not in practice.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's a lesson that we could all learn. Actually, just got a question from Greg Chabra that was related to your air traffic control for supply chain. So can you describe sort of the metrics that you use to help your customers? Are they customizing metrics for themselves? Are there some vertical industry metrics that you're able to help them provide to get them started?
Yeah, it's definitely a combination. That's a great question. One of the things, our companies are not massive multinational corporations that on their own just have a sea of data that it's hard even just to analyze that. Our customers definitely probably benefit more from looking at data across industry. So that's one of the, we've been doing a bunch of that. It's an area that we tread very carefully because of obviously privacy concerns. But I think that sort of industry-wide data can be super useful. And yet I agree also that the tension there is that, every customer is different and every business has its unique attributes. And so how can you take, and especially in machine learning, I think part of it is just understanding what works in that particular, company. You can, to use the analogy of your phone, telling you, what the traffic is to where they think you're going to go. Well, I mean, if you're a salesperson who travels to customers, you're going all kinds of different places. It's not going to be very predictive. That feature probably won't resonate with you. On the other hand, someone who goes to work in an office every day, imagine that. Maybe it'll someday happen again. That system is going to work really well and say, here's the traffic that you're going to encounter today, because we're pretty darn sure it's where you're going to go. So I think that one of the most important things in terms of customizing first is just, which parts of the product really work for that customer, and don't try to, one of the biggest things is you develop a lot of great new capabilities. And I'm sure everyone can relate to this, regardless of what kind of product you sell or what kind of service you sell. You're constantly creating these new capabilities, but getting your customers to learn about them enough to say, this might be something I want to try is a perpetual challenge. Mm-hmm. And so I think part of customization is just helping them understand what's coming and what's relevant to them. And we have something called advanced customer support, which is all about that. They know enough about your company. They're not just your sort of standard person that you might call on the phone when you need help. They know about your company. And when a new release comes out, they can say, you know what, I think you should take a look at A, B, and C. This other stuff, not relevant for you. So that's the first part of sort of customizing, is just making sure that your customers are using the right parts of your product. And as we release new machine learning AI capabilities, we're going to want the customer to be targeted towards every customer targeted to the thing that's going to work best for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Got a question from Jody Madala, who is actually going to be our next speaker. Jody's a founder of Culturora, and just segueing off of something you said, sort of, coming out of the pandemic, what's back to work really going to look like, right? That's what her company is focused on, that problem and helping companies get there. But her question is more about your situation. And, you're back in Oracle now. Oracle is this massive corporation. It started as a database and morphed into more of an ERP system. And, how do you look at the competitive landscape with, organizations like Workday popping up, from the old PeopleSoft guys, right? So there's what's new in that competitive landscape for Oracle, and where are they going?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you've listened to Larry at all, it's clear that he's sort of trying to, I'm not going to say the Apple analogy is completely apt, but obviously he and Steve Jobs are very close friends. This idea that, hardware and software engineered to work together, the kind of the full stack. And, we see that in NetSuite. I mean, the fact that, we've built a business system that runs on very, great software and infrastructure underneath it, and hardware infrastructure underneath it, I think is part of the way we deliver the best product to our customers. The other thing that's interesting is that people want to extend these systems. So inevitably they're writing software, especially larger companies, and they're going to, and giving them, infrastructure on which to do that, that's tied directly to the infrastructure that they're running their core business system on is obviously a good model for the customer. They want, because they're going to want a lot of interaction between the, applications they write and the applications that they consume. So, it's a big vision, but that's how he thinks.
Very interesting. Thank you. So just to sort of wrap things up here, Evan, and really appreciate your insights today. Very, very helpful. And I'm sure people may reach out to you from the audience today with specific questions. But obviously, as leading an organization of your size and being on the senior leadership team of Oracle, you're looking out into the future and saying, what are the macro trends? And so, obviously the AI in whatever form you want to talk about, it's been what really the focus of the last 10 years has been. What new things are you keeping an eye on over the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there is an opportunity for across the supply chain and across all kinds of businesses that work together. And I don't know if it's blockchain. I mean, part of me is like, blockchain is maybe solving the wrong problem. The systems are incompatible. I mean, you can have blockchain and it may help, but it may be like, giving a mobile phone to two people that speak a different language and saying, oh yeah, well, you couldn't communicate over landline, but here's a mobile phone. It's not going to help. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity. And of course, there's lots of different competitors with all different kinds of systems, but I do think there is a relative narrowing of the solutions across all size businesses. And there's a lot of interactivity between small and large businesses. So I think that that's going to be one of the most exciting, just easing the commerce, just easing B2B commerce. I mean, B2C commerce is becoming much, much easier. The pandemic has massively accelerated that. I don't know, B2B moves slower, but I do think there's a huge opportunity and it'll help with supply chain issues. It'll obviously make it easier for customers to switch suppliers. And if there's sort of more standards of products and communication and all that. That's an exciting area, I think, for us to look at in the next 5 to 10 years.
Great. Well, Evan, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. And, we wish you a great run here. I hope 23 becomes 46. And it continues to be a great run for you. So thank you very, very much for working with us today. And you have a wonderful day. And thanks to the audience.
Thanks so much for having me.